Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chart Chat. My name is Jeff Shaffer, and I am the Chief Operating Officer at Unifund in Cincinnati, Ohio, and here to speak about charts. And Chart Chat, it's not just chit chat, it's Chart Chat. I'm here with my esteemed colleagues and co-authors, Andy Cotgreave, Amanda Makulec, and Steve Wexler. I'll let each one introduce themselves there. Go ahead, Steve.
Hey, I'm Steve Wexler. I'm the founder, principal, and sole employee of Data Revelations.
I'm Andy Cotgreave, technical evangelist at Tableau. Great to be here.
Hi, I'm Amanda Makulec. I'm the data visualization lead at Excella and the operations director at the Data Visualization Society.
Thank you, everyone. It's great to be back with another round 12 of Chart Chat with everyone. Today's agenda, we're going to talk about index charts and log scales, and Steve's going to take the lead on that one. How the New York Times reported unemployment claims. If you saw that, that was on the front page of the New York Times, and the upshot and other news organizations. We're going to talk about humanism in data visualization, and then our normal lightning rounds with some discussion and Q&A, maybe a few screaming cats, and maybe some shout outs to some great work being done. So with that, I'm going to turn that over to Steve.
Thank you, Jeff. So, how can I compare growth rates of things that happen at different times, and what precipitated our discussion of this? Well, the answer to this is, it turns out it's something called an index chart. And one of the great heroes and rock stars of the whole trying to visualize what's been happening to us is John Byrne Murdoch of the Financial Times. And he has published a variety of different charts based on this theme. This was one of the more complicated ones. It's been fascinating to watch how these things have evolved. Here's a simpler version that was just published today in CNN. And the conceit is, well, wait a second. I thought cases in China happened way before cases in Italy, happened before cases in Spain, happened before cases in the US, which happened before the UK. The idea here is, imagine if they had all started at the same time. And so what I want you to focus on is, usually if you look along the x-axis, you're seeing dates, but here's what we're seeing. In this case, John Byrne Murdoch in the Financial Times, and a lot of other organizations, but I think he was the first to really champion this type of chart for viewing this, said instead of it being the dates when it happened, it would be a common date, which is the number of days, in this case, since 100 cases. So, oh, hold on one second here. Something is not behaving properly for me. Well, I'll just continue. Jeff Shaffer put together a very playful examination of something similar to this. So I'm going to take something which is a little stressful and go to something lighter, which is, he looked at the most viewed YouTube videos. This was maybe 4 years ago, and at the time, the top viewed video was Gangnam Style by Psy, and then wanted to know, well, Hello by Adele was in 6th place, but which one got to 1 billion views fastest? So Jeff started by plotting the data, and these are daily views of these things, but what we want to know is, we need to do a running sum of them. We need to do a cumulative count of these things. So instead of each day individually, he's adding one day to the next day to the following day. But I can't really tell, because Gangnam Style hit in the middle of 2012, and Hello by Adele was towards the end of 2015. But with an index chart, what you're doing is, you're taking this segment and you're saying, imagine if they started at the same time. Or in this case, instead of it being a date, it will be days from when it was first uploaded. And you can find Jeff's very playful and enjoyable dashboard on his Tableau public profile page, and you can compare, and we can see, hey, congratulations, Adele, at that time, you reached 1 billion views faster than anybody else. And I'm wondering to this day if that's the case. Well, what does this have to do with your own work? You know, are you visualizing the viewership of vapid YouTube videos? And hopefully you're not mired in visualizing COVID-19 cases. It turns out this is a ridiculously useful general purpose business chart. So much so, I'm happy that in the Big Book of Dashboards, we featured this in Chapter 5. We have the Executive Sales Dashboard. This is using proprietary data, but if you go to the website and we have a whole bunch of the dashboards that are downloadable, one in Excel format, I think 14 or 15 in Tableau format. We have a version of this that I put together using generic data. And the star of the show, the star of this dashboard is this visualization here. You want to know, how are we doing this quarter compared to last quarter, compared to a year ago this time, but I've only got 9 weeks of data. If I were to compare the total for 9 weeks for the total for an entire quarter, I'd be doing terribly. But instead, I can see how things are tracking. And the thing in the foreground is the dark orange, and I'm 9 weeks in, and I can see, well, I'm doing better than I was last quarter, but I'm not doing as well as I did a year ago. But overall, compared to all those other quarters, I'm doing pretty well. So this is, I think, a really good chart, and one that you should use in your own business. I want to go back to the Financial Times item for a minute, because there's some stuff in here that I think is pretty important. And that is not just the x-axis, but let's look at the y-axis for a moment. And in, I don't know how many years of visualizing data, I don't think I've ever in a business dashboard used a logarithmic scale, but let's take a look at what's happening here. And I want to show you, well, look at, here's the equal spacing by height, but in fact, this is equally spaced by showing powers of 10. So we're going from 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000. And is there a good reason for doing that? And some people mistakenly think, oh, people use log scales so they can show small numbers and big numbers on the same graph. And that is going to get you in really big trouble. That's not why you do this. And let me give you a tongue-in-cheek example. Here's a fictitious poll asking people, who is your favorite band? And we have the Beatles #1 with a huge number of people, Rolling Stones, highly respectable, and then BTS and Vanilla Ice. Vanilla Ice, a very distant fourth over there. Well, how would you visualize this? Well, I would do this with a bar chart, or I might do it with a pie chart to show the Beatles are, more than 50%. But if you're thinking, oh, I want to show large and small numbers at the same time, instead of a linear scale along the bottom, I'm going to use a logarithmic scale, and I have something which is ridiculously misleading. So, oh my God, this is a terrible thing to do. It gets a giant screaming cat. Well, why would you ever want to do something like this? And I realized I need to explain to friends, colleagues, people who are not steeped in data visualization. And if you are attending this thing or watching a recording of it, you're probably into data visualization and think about these things, but we're starting to see the use of log scales and mainstream charts. How am I going to explain this? How do you explain this to other people? And I sent out something to the hive mind of Twitter, and they were kind enough to help me out here. Oh, sorry, that's the next slide that I very much wanted to show. Here we go. A number of people suggested some great stuff, and several people piped in and said, and reminded me of something which is in R.J. Andrews' book, Info We Trust. Log scales are an attempt to show either the rate of change or the rate of growth or the ratios between things. And so here I'm going from 8 to 16, and here I'm going from 16 to 32, and here I'm going from 32 to 64. So each time this is a doubling. So a log scale is showing how fast are these things doubling in this case. So this is only going up in single increments, but the actual values are doubling and doubling. And that gets me to this example. This is so counterintuitive, but if you take a penny and double it the next day, then take the 2 pennies and double that, and you have 4 cents. Within 30 days, you have over $5 million. That is doubling at a rate of once daily. So you can see that the increase from the previous day is 100%. So I want to try to demonstrate, well, how do you explain that to somebody, and why are log scales so useful? So here I am in Tableau, and here I am, I've doubled this, and I've gone from nothing, and it's like nothing, 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 and then suddenly it's shooting up. Well, how can that be? So let me try to explain what's going on here, and I'm going to use RJ's approach to this. So I'm going to start with 1 penny on the first day. And then I've taken that 1 penny and I've doubled it, and now I have 2 pennies. Now I'm going to take the 2 pennies and I'm going to double it, and I've got 4 pennies. Take the 4 pennies and double it, I've got 8. Take the 8, double it, I've got 16. Take the 16 and double it, I've got 32. I have just run out of room over on my axes over here. So let me squish everything down, start over, keep doing this, running out of room. And eventually, when I get up to 30 days, I can see, oh my gosh, I've got over $5 million. And how did that happen? The problem is there's incredibly important activity that's simmering over here, but I can't see it because I just can't see these things on the same scale. So in fact, what I want to show, this thing is doubling equally every day. Every day it's going up by 1 doubling, by 1 exact same ratio. So instead of showing this on a linear scale, I'm going to change the axes and put this on a logarithmic scale. And I can see, wait a minute, so that thing which was that swooping thing is now just a completely straight line. But if I look over here on the left, I can see I'm going from a penny to 10 cents to $1 to $10, etc. So in fact, it is growing exponentially. But what I'm trying to capture here is the rate and a rate of change and the consistency of it doubling. Well, let me show you why we're starting to see these logarithmic scales and the notion of flattening the curve. I'm going to show you 2 different scenarios, one where I'm doubling on a daily basis, and the other where, well, I don't know how fast it's growing. And let me show you what these things look like. And gee, just looking at this thing, I can't tell what's going on here. This is on a linear scale. Am I growing really slowly? Or is it in fact, no, this is just growing at half the rate. At 60 days, this thing is going to shoot up. So if instead of keeping it like this, I use a logarithmic scale, I can see, oh, at the beginning, these things are tracking, but this is going down further and further and further. And now you're seeing it's still increasing, but it's flattening off. So this first line is acting as almost a reference line. I can see if it were doubling on a daily basis, it would be on the straight line. But in fact, it's starting to flatten. And that is what John Byrne Murdoch ended up adding. This is, I think, from around March 27th or something like this, March 28th. He started putting in these brilliant, hey, this would show the trajectory of cases we're doubling every day, every 2 days, every 3 days. And you can see where we are and how things are working with that. I do want to look at this curve for a minute. Here we're tracking sales, let's imagine. And most people who are trying to show, look how good sales are, don't want to show it flattening. So I want you to be aware of a graphic that might mislead you. So instead of showing it this way, which is something we'd want to see in the cases or deaths, we'll go back to the linear scale. And it looks like, wow, look at this. Sales are really increasing. And we might fill it in as an area chart to show you cumulative gains, cumulative sales. And this was shown with great infamy by Tim Cook a while back, showing cumulative iPhone sales. Wow, look how great we're doing. Well, look at where the tweet is coming from. It's coming from a handle called Calling Bullshit, which is a book which will be coming out on August 4th by 2 authors, one of whom is one of my favorite people to follow right now, Carl Bergstrom. And he's done a great job explaining so many things behind the pandemic. But also, I'm looking forward to this book. And if we go back to this example, and if we look at the actual daily values, look, this thing looks like it's increasing, but every day it's actually going down a bit. So yes, sales are increasing, but not nearly to the same extent that they had, and they're starting to flatten off. And you see that in the logarithmic scale, but you don't see it in the cumulative flow chart. And I have not published any of these things, but I'm certainly looking at what's happening in different states and different counties and trying to get a handle on cases and deaths around COVID-19. And New York is the harbinger in the United States. And if you don't have this on a logarithmic scale, which I do over here, it's just really hard to see anything because New York is so far ahead and all these things get squished down. So that's the reason for the logarithmic scale becoming mainstream. And I'm going to continue to try to come up with ways to get people to understand it and why it is so effective. And so that's my take on log scales.
Excellent stuff, Steve. There are so many comments and questions from people. Gosh, where should we start? Your index charts, I think some people really like them. Maria and Ginny both said they use them for enrollment, comparing enrollment for different semesters, and there's loads of great things. I had a question about, do you find lay people understand index charts? Does that x-axis confuse people?
I've been doing a lot of talking. I'm going to defer to Amanda and Jeff, who will both have to explain these things. So go ahead.
When I look at index charts, I think of the need to make sure that there's clear explainer text on what it is you're looking at and what the relative kind of starting point is. I think they're really helpful in a lot of ways. And I like them personally. I think they're really effective in looking at the data that we have right now on COVID-19. I think John did a great job with those pieces. But I think clear explainer text that gives people more information, whether that's written in text or embedded on a tooltip that say, here's how to read me, I think is really important for these kind of chart types or axis types that are a little bit different from what someone's mental model might be of what that should look like. Jeff?
I would add in, sometimes somebody made a comment that, an index chart's a way to normalize the data, by time. And that's a great point. One that we use that is kind of an index chart is you just show monthly something against last month. And your point, Steve, you're 9 days into the month. How do you compare to last month? In our book, we have a pace chart that Ryan Sleeper came up with where you have a bar and you sort of have the target line of where you want to be at the end of the month or the end of the quarter or the end of the year. And then you have another dotted line, where you are at that point in time. But you don't get to see that over time, how it's doing. And I think the index chart enables you to do that. If you plot something, month over month, seeing last month's curve or your projection, and then showing this month, sort of indexing against it. I think it's easy to read. And we have in fact, there's one report on our Tableau server that gets used all the time, day by day, looking at that. And I haven't had any issues with readers understanding that.
Something briefly, it isn't just things, days from when something first happened. It could be days until something happens. And this is something that we use to track registrations for back when we were doing live in-person workshops. And gee, we are several days out from this workshop. Are we tracking ahead or behind when other workshops are? And so instead of it being the date of the event, it's days until the event happens. And it proves to be pretty effective. I would say, I think this is an important mainstream business chart. And if I were doing a charts 101 type of thing, I would want business people to have this in their vocabulary and be comfortable with it.
Thomas makes a great point. He said, I think index charts are much more intuitive than log scales. I agree with that. Mainstream people understanding log scales is much more difficult. Although, Steve, your example was fantastic with the doubling of the pennies.
Yeah, you got a
Thanks.
bunch of love for that example from some of the commenters. I have a question.
Appreciate it.
What is the Steve? You got to answer. What is the Mendoza line? Somebody asked.
Okay. This is a term in baseball. There was a baseball player named Minnie Mendoza who barely kept alive in the major leagues, and he had a 200 batting average, which means that he was only successful at hitting 20% of the time. And one of his great, I think George Brett was one of his teammates, and was struggling. He was slumping, and someone said, "Oh, you better be careful. You're about to you're about to cross the Mendoza line." Now, this has actually jumped into mainstream business parlance. The Mendoza line in business is the demarcation point between acceptable and unacceptable mediocrity. Hey, you are acceptably mediocre. So, just looking at these various things that we had, and we set our threshold, that minimum threshold for a workshop is 10.
You should share your screen again, Steve, just to show you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, but thank you, Jeff. Hold on.
On the workshops.
Share screen. And so there's the Mendoza line. Anything above that, our goal is 20. Everything above 10 is okay.
Very good. I had one question that I've never considered before. Is it ever okay to show a log scale on a bar chart? Because that example was really good, and I was like, is that a general rule?
So I heard John Schwabish and Andy Kirk discussing this on one of their things and discussions, and said, in general, it's probably a really bad idea with a bar chart, but it works with lines and in the right place trying to show growth rate. By the way, it is still hard to understand this. I don't want to tell you how many hours trying to put that example together, and I saw some wonderful explanation from colleagues. Again, I want to make sure I'm basing that on RJ's way of explaining it. So give him the props for it.
You're going to set me up for that question, because being Mr. Pre-attentive attribute, I'm going to say no way. If the height of the bar is measuring something, then trying to put that on a log scale is going to be super confusing. I would throw the caveat out there where I think it worked really well for Steve is if you don't have it on a common baseline. He had those floating bars, and showing the growth up, it turned into a line, right? And so I think that works. But if you're trying to compare height of those bars, I think that's a really bad idea.
Yeah.
We have a question from Ginny about the best practice for determining the days on index charts. And I wanted to address that from it depends on the context piece. So as you look at John's chart as an example, one of the reasons that he picked the index point that he did around the number of cases is because one single case, starting at one case, wouldn't have been as meaningful, because that doesn't really speak to there being an outbreak in that country yet, right? There could be one case that's been imported from a travel related case or something else, which is why we wait for a later case count. So the 10 cases or the 100 cases or the 10 deaths. So I think it depends on your context. I think from a business context, there are certain other reasons for your business. You might choose a different starting point, but that's something that really has to be considered on what's the analysis you're trying to do and the key takeaways you're trying to enable through using that kind of index chart.
Yeah, I think there's a technical question Ginny's asking in there, because she's using a Tableau term in there. So she's asking, I think, would you do it with a date scaffold or a calculated field? Unfortunately, it depends, right? It kind of depends on what your data is structured at, how many. If you're missing a lot of dates, you might have to date scaffold, or you might have to do some, some fun stuff with data densification or something to get your dates filled in there. But you could also do that with a date diff for a calculated field.
If you're comparing quarterly things, it's complicated, more complicated than just days within like the days from when an event or days until an event. So I think I pilfered somebody else's pretty complicated calculation and put it in the workbook that's downloadable.
That's how we all work with Tableau, isn't it? Use
Yes,
Google.
exactly. Who created the
Someone
first
else's
tough
idea.
calculation?
That's how coders also work too, you realize,
Yeah.
right? It's not just Tableau. This is like there's no shame in going ahead and learning from someone else solving the same problem, which is a good thing. I think one thing I want to call out before we kind of wrap up and move on to our next topic is around kind of rules and breaking rules, because that's been one of the debates about the log scales or the linear scales that have been used on some of the different charts about the COVID-19 data. And there are some certain kind of requirements or rules in epidemiology on how you report rates or ratios that talk about only reporting those on log scales. And there was an interesting letter to the editor from a while back for the American Journal of Epi talking about the one kind of use case there where that doesn't hold as well is when you want a more general population to understand relative risk. And how well does that communicate to a more general population? And so I'll throw that link into the chat box for folks if they want to take a peek at that, about what that means and when we might think about breaking the rules to make research and complicated information more accessible to a lay population.
Shall we move on to the next segment?
Absolutely.
Yep.
All right. Well, the next piece is talking about the way the New York Times reported the unemployment rate with a pretty dramatic chart right on the front page of the New York Times. I can't say that I've ever seen anything like that before. And it's pretty staggering. Got the attention of a lot of people. Created a lot of activity on Twitter. This was March 27th. They reported this, and I'll jump ahead to say that the day before they showed this chart on the Upshot in an interactive piece. And interesting enough, the claims doubled again, and I think went into the 6 million range, even making it more dramatic. I really like this. I like a number of things about this. I think it gets the point across. It kept the scale accurate, and I think to myself, how else would I show this? If I did anything else, I think we'd probably have it up here and be, complaining about it for a screaming cat. If I used bubble charts, for example, and showed a really big bubble for the large unemployment against all these other bubbles, and I'd lose my element over time. If I broke the axis in some way and created a chopped off bar, I'd lose the sense of scale. So to me, thinking about how else would I show this, I also appreciate, the design decisions that they did. They had this sort of recession period to show the financial crisis with a gray band around it, and they kept the time scale and the Y scale consistent to be able to show how dramatic this was. And I think people talk about a V-shaped recovery. I don't think anybody's expecting we're going to flip a switch and go right back to everybody's fully employed. But it'll be interesting to see this chart later when it starts to go down. Probably big jumps that'll go back down and maybe get us back down to recession unemployment levels. And I also appreciate the color use. They didn't lead off with a red, in this instance. Although here, I guess it's a little more, a red orange. It's a little more dramatic, but I really appreciate what they did. I know Steve had some comments on this one.
Yeah, let me share my screen. And so I didn't like it at all.
Here we go. This is what chat's about.
Let me make my case. So here was the New York Times. Here's the Wall Street Journal on the same day doing something pretty similar and using red, and doing one of the, oh my gosh, they're breaking into the masthead. This is I found both of these things. Really, did you need to do this? Particularly, I guess the one that I found much more upsetting was the New York Times. And I said, this is like, right out of the Al Gore playbook, where he gets in the worker bucket that goes up, and to show, oh my God, this is what's going to happen. And I said, and I thought that was actually very effective in Inconvenient Truth. And Andy is really good at publicly pointing out my hypocrisy, but very politely. He's going, well, I don't quite understand. Why is it okay for Al Gore to do this here? And but it's not okay for the New York Times to do this. And I'm going to stop the share so that, that I can look earnestly into the camera and try to get people make my point here, which is, in Al Gore's case, people are asleep or complacent and trying to wake them up. On March 27th, I don't think I was ever more hyper aware in my entire life of things, of what was happening, the stuff that Cuomo was presenting. He's the governor of New York. Was probably the most dire type of situation where this is what we have, this is what we need. I was so hypersensitive. It was like I had the worst migraine ever, and the New York Times decided to play the music as loud as possible and turn on every light in the household. Oh, you're not feeling crappy enough about everything? Look at this chart, which, by the way, you showed the way that it did it online, which is, oh my God, it's this huge bar and it's way higher than everything else. And I get it, that bar is really high. But did you need to go, this is just so unprecedented bad that if you were okay, yeah, I was okay with that. But not with the New York. I guess I'm upset, Andy, because they made me feel worse at a bad time.
And much as I also like to disagree with you on these conversations, I actually think that's an interesting point. I concede your point, Steve. Go ahead, Amanda.
Steve,
it speaks to the way we feel different things, right? When we see information. I mean, the question I look at this on is, we had to look at this once where it's the last point on the chart. I've been talking to some colleagues who do a lot of work or have worked a lot with finance data and other things. And they've said all of our standard charts that we use to track different things are all now going to be broken for a long time, because we have these data points here that we aren't going to know what to do with. So are we going to leave gaps or break them, or what are we going to do? Because we'll lose every other nuance that makes those charts usable.
And do not put this on a log scale, okay? I mean, Andy.
Yep.
Fess up. Is there something else about this chart that bothers you? I bet you there is.
Yes. I mean, actually, go back to the front cover. Right. So newspapers have a job to create visceral experiences, which I think we would all agree that does. I think punching people awake instead of punching them when they're down is actually quite a good point. The more I see this chart, that tiny little white gap in the bottom between the latest bar and everything else, all I can see when I look at this chart now is, why is there a gap there? Why is there a gap there? What? My reaction is getting stronger and stronger to that.
Nobody was employed during that period. We had a quarter off.
Yeah. No one was unemployed. No one was unemployed. That was our safe zone, right? I think this is actually a great point someone made. And I actually agree with this from even we all live in kind of urban centers in the US, right? Jeff's in Cincinnati, Steve's in New York, I'm in DC, Andy's in the UK and London. And so we look at this, and someone made the point that these are global newspapers. Other people look at these that aren't just Americans in the US. And so it does make a statement about what's happening in the US to other audiences. And when I'm looking at this, I'm also thinking, what are the other ways this feeds other narratives, right? So I've heard the argument of the kind of all of these other knock-on effects are worse than the disease. And does this feed that narrative in some ways in a negative way? So I think thinking about kind of how it strikes people in different ways and how it could be misused, even if it's accurate information. There was also a point about how it might not be accurate in the sense that you're not disaggregating furloughs and other kind of people who are filing for unemployment for different reasons into separate groups or categories. How many might get jobs back? And we just don't know right now.
The natural reaction when I see this is not alarm, but I just want to dive deeper into the data. I want to see this by industry. Restaurants are probably 80 or 90%, and something like retail where, Home Depot or a Kroger is open, but a Macy's and Neiman Marcus is closed. Or you look at manufacturing. I want to see these, by industries. I want to dive deep into an interactive visualization. But, Steve, it's also fair to say you're alarmist on any given day, aren't you? I mean,
hey, I'm seeing some comments that are in there. I would say and again, this is, I'm arguing, well, I'm upset, I don't like it because it made me feel really bad. But you could take that whole chart and just where the picture of the people in the gowns in the emergency room, you could fit that entire chart in there, and I'd have no problem with that. And you would see, oh my gosh, in the context historically of this, something like that, it is so large. And I would not have found it as deeply upsetting at a time when I don't think it was necessary to upset me. And that's just my selfishness.
I downloaded the data behind this chart this morning. You can get this data going back decades just from the Department of Labor.
Someone had mentioned, hey, just a quick, sorry, Jeff. Someone was mentioning that they couldn't copy and paste out of the chat window. Maybe it's working for me because I'm a panelist, but it appears to be working now. So those we've been posting links, and I think you can get them.
So I wonder if maybe we can pivot over and talk a little bit about the kind of human story behind this chart, which is where I'd love to have us focus for a little bit more of our conversation around data humanism. Does that seem fair?
Yep, I have one more if we have time. I
Sure,
think
go for it.
just this other New York Times was getting a lot of attention on the maps, just the way that they mapped it in a technique that we probably would have prior to the pandemic said, oh, why are we mapping things in that way? But it created an interesting discussion. Chad Skelton posted this. He thought originally they were the same chart. One is showing cases on the left, the other is showing deaths on the right. But it brought an interesting discussion up on Twitter and some other venues and even some other podcasts I've heard, and start thinking about, made me think about these bubbles that as they get bigger and bigger and bigger, whether this is county or cities or whatever it might be on the left-hand side, when you get down to that granularity, the bubbles start ending up on top of each other, making it really hard to see those. Not to mention, size is just not trying to estimate or compare a size of a bubble is a rather difficult challenge. So there was a lot of discussion about that, whether we should be using shaded maps versus circle maps versus these area diagrams on the map. So I thought I would bring that up. Mm. What do you think, Andy?
Every chart is a compromise. All the rules about data visualizations are just guidelines, and as needs arise, I think it's important to challenge your own guidelines. Also, people get familiar, right? If they're seeing a chart with circle on it day after day after day after day throughout this crisis, then sometimes you have to just shake it up and do something different to catch their eyes. We are trying to engage people as the stories change throughout this crisis and in all time. So sometimes changing the chart can refresh people's eyes. Wouldn't do that on my business dashboards. You want to keep things consistent, but it seems perfectly valid for me from the New York Times.
I like how this makes it easier to see all the individual spots a lot. I thought it was a nice iteration on their initial chart when the proportional symbols just don't work as well anymore.
I would just mention one technical issue, that if you're going to make an interactive chart with dots, circles like that, just be careful about the Z order. I mocked this up in Tableau. This is a workbook on Tableau Public that you can download and play, but just mapping things like China, the big circle, I can't get to some of the circles underneath it because of the Z order, whether it's alphabetical, in this case it's ordered with the legend, or if it's an alphabetical order, then you can get to Armenia and you can get to Colombia, but you can't get to the other countries that are after China in alphabetical order. So just being careful that we can get to the small dots, I think is just a important feature if you're going to make an interactive visualization. Otherwise, on something like this, if you were interacting with it, you wouldn't be able to move your way around.
That is a good tip. Mm-hmm. I like that.
All right. Well, I'll pass it over to Amanda to talk about data humanism.
Thanks. So, as we were talking about different topics for tackling during this week's chart chat, I brought up data humanism because I think we've been talking a lot about charts that aggregate information, right? They aggregate information across multiple different categories or groups. People called that out actually in our window when we were looking at the chat. And as we think about how we see the people represented in this data and information, I was struck by some of the other ways that I saw people represented around joblessness, right? The photos and the images of people waiting in unemployment lines. And I've seen this kind of echoed in different ways. People are plotting and talking about the effects of the global pandemic and things we see otherwise. It's not just something we look at in a pandemic context. And so today I want to talk a little bit about data humanism and flag Georgia Lupi's manifesto. Everyone butchers her name, and I'm sure I am too. But she has this manifesto that talks about small data and perhaps imperfect small data, but number as people, which I really appreciate a lot. And thinking about, especially from a health perspective, and my background is personally in public health before I became a data viz person, thinking about the people represented in the numbers and really caring about how you represent those people that are in the numbers. And there's been some great examples of ways people have done this, either through imagery or through visualization over the last couple weeks. Georgia is perhaps better known in some circles for her Dear Data project that she did with Stephanie Posavac, where she actually mailed paper postcards back and forth over the course of a year and did 52 weeks of hand-drawn data visualizations. And Jeff, if I'm not mistaken, you have endeavored and embarked on this year-long project yourself in the past?
I did it with Andy Kriebel for 52 weeks, and we sent postcards, and we called it the Dear Data 2 project, following in their footsteps. Yeah, that was a lot of work.
It is, because you have to collect the data, right? So that's the tricky part, is you're both actually figuring out what you're going to make, collecting the data, and then drawing something creative. But it's a great exercise, I think, in thinking about how data gets collected and what it represents. And I saw there was a person who shared that she was doing her own Dear Coronavirus project and actually looking at mapping different things about her weeks right now, a week of feelings, a week of communication in these postcards to coronavirus. And I thought that this was just a really compelling way of thinking about how to take the idea of a big global event and think about how that's impacting you or me locally or me within my own life. And I can think about maybe plotting like which room I'm spending the most hours sitting in terms of whether I'm sitting upstairs at the desk or downstairs at the desk. Where am I moving? Where am I going? But there are lots of ways we can think about kind of how our own individual lives are being impacted, which I think is really powerful. She makes the point that we're really at this point, as we think about this manifesto for data humanism, thinking about going beyond just a technical approach to data, putting a data set together, plugging it into a tool like Tableau and playing around and seeing what kind of charts we create. And instead of thinking more about how the data actually represents knowledge and peoples and behaviors, which I really appreciate from a thinking about who's represented in the numbers. And so let's take a couple examples of things that we've seen about COVID-19 and the coronavirus pieces, mainly because I think that's what I'm still been consuming, even though I've been trying not to. One article talked about the number of studies that had been published about the novel coronavirus and looked at that broken down by peer review status. So of 153 different studies, 92 were not peer reviewed. And right now there's a huge draw towards putting research out fast, which is great. But there's also the challenge that that means that research is going out without the same level of peer review and rigor that we might have in other contexts. So there's always a balancing act. And I thought that Reuters actually did a great job of making this look a lot more visceral in terms of how I responded to seeing this visualization. Instead of just plotting an aggregate number or a count or a sum, I'm looking at actually the front page of every single one of these studies. And each front page has been colored based on whether it was peer reviewed or not, with the yellow highlights being not peer reviewed. And these stamps that are thrown on there about being withdrawn. And this causes me to have a much more visceral response to looking at what this kind of overall story is than just looking at a bar chart. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this kind of display. We've seen this before with transcript annotations and other ways of actually visualizing articles or a story or a transcript. So I don't think it's new and novel in that respect, but it certainly draws me in a lot more than one more bar chart.
I think it's stellar.
I like that a lot. It's a form of a small multiple visualization, right? A real simple look, and I love the little, somebody pointed out the stamps, that should show which ones not only highlighted but withdrawn.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
think one
don't
of
think
the-
it's important that I be able to make an exact comparison. It's important to realize most of these things are very questionable.
Mm-hmm.
There's for me, I mean, so I agree. This is a visceral, creates the visceral response. But the challenge we have to think of is, let's say we're doing this in our business life, right? How do we choose our moments to use this kind of approach,
Mm-hmm.
and compared to the let's aggregate the data approach? I don't have an answer yet to that question, but it's making me wonder it. Anybody?
Well, I mean, the one that jumps out in my mind is the discussion in our book with Simon Beaumont about the the health initiative, the dashboard that he put together, and he talks, it's in his commentary that's added in the book that he talks about, look, these are people, and when you're talking about a bar or aggregated data, that's great on a statistical level. You might need to know that answer. How many patients did we have? But if you're that patient, you're a dot all of a sudden, right? And so that's very important. It's very personal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky balance, I think. And I think it depends on what you're doing with it. And to me, this is that line between data journalism and data for decision making, and that there are different kind of purposes and functions there. And I think this example from Reuters is a great example of data journalism. I think that we can learn from that and think about kind of how we borrow from some of these techniques and how we communicate information, whether it's on a dashboard or in, say, more like slide decks or other reports. There's also been a lot of focus on remote work, a lot of charts and graphs about who's able to work remotely and how many Americans can work remotely. These are some charts about the data we knew before COVID-19 from Pew. And I don't want to dwell on these as much as thinking more about the ways in which remote work is kind of being created and being embodied in our current environment. Slate went ahead and instead of collecting data, they collected photos and said, give us a photo from out your window. What are you seeing right now? And have a whole string. I've got over 300 different photos from people saying, this is what my view looks like. And I mean, I'm a bit envious. My view doesn't involve mountains or water when I look out into my grassy courtyard. But at the same time, I recognize that as we look at kind of work from home statistics and aggregate numbers and have this focus on the kind of what's happening to us working from home, there's a large segment of our population in the US, and I know in other countries, who aren't able to work from home. They don't have the privilege of being able to do that. And so as we think about some of these stories that come out and the focus on these different work from home statistics and pieces, how do we again get down and think about the different people underneath those stats? How do we think about the different groups represented or not represented in that data? This is one of many illustrations that Danielle Koch has been doing on her Oh Happy Danny Instagram, kind of trying to share that story about the people represented in the data or not. And as we talk about things like working from home, who's represented there? We've also seen this in looking at just aerial images. This is a shot or a picture from outside of San Antonio, Texas, looking at people lined up to receive food. And as I think about what that chart of unemployment data looks like, that big bar on the New York Times that has certain different responses for different people, seeing all of these cars lined up, just to me, like I look at that, and that to me is the story of what the impact has been in the US as we look at different challenges and issues people are facing. The quote from the article stated that this was for around 600 families who had been expected, and they had an extra 4,000 households show up. So 10,000 families or households showed up to receive food that day. And if we were to just approximate, which may be flawed in its own ways, that one car is one household, if we look at this little box is 342 cars. If you look at about 18 cars by 19 rows, this one single box, and we see it repeating, we see the line going back down and out the way to get in. As you look at that and you look at 10,000 households, and this is only 342 cars, that means there are 29 repeating shapes of that same size that would represent the number of people who showed up one day, who were food insecure and looking for some kind of help. And to me, as we think about these numbers and we think about these charts, the charts and the aggregations are really important for us because they help us understand the severity of some of the challenges we're facing. But I think we can't forget the people who are represented in those different statistics and in those different numbers. And sometimes imagery is one of the most powerful ways to get that across. The last kind of sobering example I'll share and then kind of open it up for a discussion is Reuters did a really striking piece where when you land on their data journalism piece about the deaths in Italy, it actually starts a ticker. that tells you the countdown clock to when another person would pass away in Italy due to coronavirus. And as you look at that, like there's just such a visceral response that you get thinking about not a huge number on the front of the New York Times, but about each of these 3-minute and 35-second increments representing one human life. And I think as we talk about all these data and statistics, it's important that we think about what that functionally means and how we see, for example, other charts plotting the number of pages of obituaries that we're seeing. And we're starting to see this in the US too. And you can see as you work from the bottom to the top, you see more and more orange boxes representing obituary pages. And if you go so far as to looking at the actual newspapers themselves, this is what it looked like at the bottom on Saturday, February 29th in a local Italian newspaper. That's what it looked like about a month later on Saturday, March 21st. And when you look at those, like you start to really unpack the fact that each of these are pictures and images and stories. And so as we think about how we're communicating and how we're visualizing data, whether it's in this current crisis or in other environments where data represents people and health and lives and stories, I think we have to think about how that gets represented and how we make sure that our aggregate counts and numbers don't lose that human perspective.
Yeah, Amanda, do you want to, this is, of course, Chart Chat, and we did show one screaming cat in our Slack channel. We've been sharing some others. Do you have that other one available that you want? Do
you want to pivot away from the sombering reality that I've just walked through to the screaming cats?
Yeah, kind of desperately.
Yeah. So as we think about this, I would just close with the thought that Reuters did a great article talking about how they choose what they visualize, which I'd encourage folks to take a look at and read, and talking about the fact that when you even have huge piles of data sets, we don't visualize them all, right? We pick and choose where the stories are. And I think that there are some great kind of stories and discussions coming out from different graphics teams talking about the ways in which they're making choices right now that we can all learn from a lot. But Steve, I'm all for throwing out a screaming cat if you'd like some screaming cats. So.
I just wanted to just echo that comment. Again, thinking, okay, so we've just seen the tragic cases of COVID, but again, this is when we're working in business as data analysts. What are we trying to do with our data? We're trying to make change, inform people, make better decisions, and whether that's to customers, our bosses, or our colleagues. Mm-hmm. And it's not always going to be a bar chart that captures people's imagination, right? And yeah, it's incumbent on us to take that approach to our business work as well.
Well, and if you're working in healthcare, right? And you're working with data that represent patients, or you're working with in education and you're representing children. I mean, I think that there are ways we can think about the people represented in those numbers and how that data gets collected, whether we're working in business or data journalism. I don't think that those are two entirely divorced fields that don't have a lot of overlap in what we should think about and consider and how we create our plots.
Yeah. One last thing, can I just give a big shout out for Dear Data as a bedtime reading book? I've got two daughters they were 11 and 9 at the time, and we sat down and we went through every postcard and looked at all the nuances of data, and it was a really good experience, really good way to dive into that book.
Oh, look at that. Jeff, are these your Dear Data postcards?
No, these are my students, actually. I was going to shout out myself. My assignment in my data visualization class was just due this past Saturday. And the students did some great postcards. This student was looking at the task they completed with a goal or a task and made a flower. This one looked at their sleep and made a sheep, counting the sheep. This person, I mean, the details on that one were amazing. Listening habits of the top 100 songs and their kitchen. And then this one, I really love this one. They went around their neighborhood and looked at the garage doors, whether it was one door, two doors, one car, two-car garage, and mapped out their whole neighborhood about whether it was a painted garage or a stained garage and how many cars it held. So yeah, I could speak to that one a lot.
That's so cool.
Amazing.
I love it. I think that it's such a nice example of how you can find data in such interesting and nuanced and unique places. We think about these counts of dollars and people and other things, but looking at this, it's a great way of thinking about how there's so much data that just surrounds us in our daily life.
Yeah.
I also have some analysis to share with you. Let's see what you guys think about this particular analysis to the coronavirus. Yeah.
I mean, is that true? Are those the only places I can get bubble tea? I want to know.
I'm not sure.
There's a lot of boba spots that have popped up in DC, just saying.
A friend of mine posted on Facebook something similar to this, saying Latin alphabets and non-Latin alphabets, and prompted a huge, like, bitter argument. And it was like, oh my God.
Well, the tough part there is China, right? China's you're going to be your outlier, and maybe Iran.
Yeah.
I would say we are not experts in type of tea consumption to make a deep commentary upon this analysis.
Well, let's go ahead and I will do a quick share on our other awesome type screaming cats that we had. We've been looking at a lot of different charts that have a lot of different challenges, and we took a look at this fun guy.
You're not sharing your screen.
I'm about to share. Yeah, I don't want to give away the number of screaming cats.
Sorry.
All right. So what have we got here? Oh, I'm going to give away the screaming cats anyways. All right, let's take a look at this guy. This is a chart meant to help us make sense of how different numbers are varying as IHME's predictive model on peak predicted daily deaths changes and gets updated. It's got a lot of information and a lot of effort that's been put into laying this out and making sense of it. And we've got some bouncing balls of sorts with some arrows. Steve, what do you think of this chart? I remember you loved this one, right?
Yeah, not as much as I loved the New York Times front page one. We had a discussion there, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on, and then looked at the x-axis and go, wait, those aren't, I thought they were values along the bottom. They're not, they're dates. But wait, how can that thing that's blue, which is the top blue thing, says the top blue thing with the 149, that's April 8th. But no, it's actually April 24th. What? I'm finding this very confusing.
I sat and tried to construct a sentence to describe what's showing on Florida, and I couldn't. I guess it says on April the 8th, it predicted a peak of 149 that would be on April the 23rd. Then on April the 5th, they predicted a peak of 175 that would be on May the 3rd. And on April the 2nd, they predicted the peak would be 232 and it'd be on the 21st of April.
Oh, nice, Andy.
That was pretty good.
But between the four of us, we've devoted probably 2 person hours to working on this chart. And that's not the point of data visualization.
No. And the loop at the bottom down here, that I just kind of look at the looping situation because the numbers overlap too much, but they're not really the same.
Which one's which?
Oh my God! Did any of us try and redraw this chart? By the way,
No.
I did not try to redraw it personally. We did award it some screaming cats for sure.
Yeah.
I went and looked for who else had reported on this to try to make sense of it. One example was this one from the Washington Post, where they had instead tried to keep the uncertainty bars, which is what I thought was really distressing to me, that was lost. Around the uncertainty bars here. It's just the point estimates. And so they tried to look at kind of what those looked like in terms of areas of uncertainty and use lines to represent what the shape looked like and where the peaks were. But I haven't found a good example of how this has been done well.
I wish I'd given some time thinking about how to redraw it, because it's always easy to criticize, right?
Yeah.
I guess what I would like to see is the whole curve, not just the peak, and then plot the 3 curves so that you could see the shape of the curve moving, right to left and up and down, where is the peak and how high is it?
It's almost like one of those hot plots that Jessica Holman talks about, where the curves or the things move. Hot plots. I forget what the acronym stands for, but using animation to show uncertainty, basically.
Yeah.
Somebody asked the context of a screaming cat. That comes from the big book of dashboards, where we felt like if, kind of meant to flip through the book as sort of a desk reference. And if you open a page, how do you know whether you should make that particular chart or not? So we wanted some sort of icon in the chart to say, probably not a good idea to make a chart that looks like this. And so we came up with the screaming cat.
I don't know if people can see
we're
my gallery.
in share mode, so these are very small.
All right, so here's a
thumbnails
picture
at the
from the
moment.
book. The point being,
You
if
get
you
out
open
of,
our book and see
You
this,
get out of,
see this radial bar chart, don't do it.
So-
This is a well-thumbed copy of the big book of dashboards.
So we're wrapping up at about 12 o'clock right now. Jeff, do you want to close us out?
Sure. I will. One sec there, unless Steve has those slides readily available.
I'm ready, Jeff. I can go ahead.
Go ahead.
If you want. So very quick. The next chart chat will be on May 8th. And that's the URL for it, bit.ly/chartchat13.